Welcome. I can't express how glad I am that you are here. Tonight I have decided to try something different. I have basically tried to handle Ned Stark's life as if he were any other historical figure and create a video as I normally do. I hope you enjoy this and that it helps you fall asleep. If you do enjoy your time here, please consider subscribe to my channel. But only if you truly want to, of course. And perhaps you also want to give the video a like. It helps me more than you can imagine. Anyway, let's get on with the story. Sit back, relax, get some snacks and a warm blanket. Enjoy. In the farthest reaches of a vast and ancient realm, where the land stretches toward horizons wrapped in mist and memory, there exists a place where winter holds dominion over the hearts of men. This is a story from another world, a world of castles and kingdoms, of honor and sacrifice, of families whose roots run deeper than the oldest trees. It is the story of one man born into an ancient lineage who would come to embody the very spirit of his homeland, whose life would be woven into the fabric of his realm's history like threads of silver through dark wool. Let us journey together now, in this quiet hour, to a place where snow falls soft upon ancient stones, where direwolves once roamed free through endless forests, and where the words of one family echoed across centuries, "Winter is coming." These words were not merely a warning, but a way of life, a philosophy etched into the very souls of those who spoke them. As evening settles over the world and shadows grow long, we turn our attention northward to a time long past and a place that exists now only in imagination and memory. There, in that distant land of ice and honor, lived a lord whose name would be remembered, a man called Eddard Stark, though to those who knew him best, he was simply Ned. The air grows cool and still. The light fades gently, and our story begins, as all stories must, with the land itself, the vast, unforgiving, beautiful North. Part 1. The Ancient North and the Roots of Winter. The North is a realm unto itself, a kingdom within a kingdom, stretching across distances so vast that a rider might travel for weeks and see nothing but wilderness, punctuated only occasionally by the humble dwellings of scattered villages or the stone fortresses of lesser houses sworn to the great family that ruled from Winterfell. This is a land shaped by cold, by hardship, by the endless cycle of seasons that turns, inevitably, toward the long darkness of winter. The soil of the north is thin and rocky in many places, yielding crops only through stubborn persistence and careful husbandry. The growing seasons are brief, the winters long and merciless. Those who dwell here learn from childhood that survival depends upon preparation, upon thinking always of the lean times ahead, upon storing away provisions and gathering strength for the trials that must come. The people of the North are shaped by their environment, made hard by necessity, yet bound together by bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that run deeper than blood. Forests cover much of the northern landscape, dense and dark and ancient beyond reckoning. These are not the tame woodlands of southern realms, where noble lords might hunt for sport on summer afternoons. These are primal places where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy, where wolves and bears roam freely, and where, in the deepest shadows, older and stranger things might yet linger. The great forest called the Wolf's Wood sprawls for hundreds of miles, a sea of pine and oak and sentinel trees whose roots were old when men first came to these lands. Rivers cut through the northern territories, their waters cold and clear, flowing down from mountains in the west and north, carving valleys and providing arteries of commerce and communication in a land where roads are few and often treacherous. In winter, these rivers freeze solid, becoming highways of ice that can bear the weight of laden wagons and marching armies alike. The winters here are not like winters in gentler climes. When true winter comes to the north, it can last for years, burying the land beneath snowdrifts taller than a mounted knight, freezing the earth so deeply that the dead cannot be buried but must be burned or stored in crypts carved from stone. During these long winters, villages can be cut off from one another for months at a time, and the people huddle close to their fires, rationing food carefully, telling old stories to pass the endless dark hours, and waiting for the spring that seems as though it may never come. Yet for all its harshness, the north possesses a stark and terrible beauty. The play of light across snow-covered fields under a clear winter sky, the silence of a forest after a fresh snowfall, the shimmering curtains of colored light that dance across the northern heavens on the coldest nights. The people of the north love their homeland not despite its severity, but in some way because of it. The land has made them what they are, and they would not choose to be anything else. Into this realm, 8,000 years before our story properly begins, came the first of the Stark family, or so the legends tell. History and myth blend together in tales so old that no one can say with certainty where truth ends and legend begins. The ancient stories speak of Bran the Builder, a figure more legend than man, who lived in the Age of Heroes, that misty epoch after the long night when great deeds were done and the foundations of the world as it would become were laid. Bran the Builder, the tales say, raised the mighty wall, that colossal fortification of ice and stone and ancient magic that spans the northern frontier, protecting the realms of men from whatever dangers might dwell beyond. He built Winterfell too, they say, raising its thick walls and carving its deep crypts, and establishing his line there as the kings of winter, rulers of the north, in their own right, answerable to no southern sovereign. Whether one man truly accomplished all these legendary feats, or whether the name Bran the Builder became attached over centuries to the accumulated achievements of many men, hardly matters now. What matters is that the Starks of Winterfell traced their lineage back through an unbroken line of 8,000 years, through ages of heroes and villains, through wars and peace, through the rise and fall of kingdoms to the south, through droughts and famines and plagues, through everything that time and fortune could bring. The Stark blood endured. For thousands of years, the Starks ruled as kings in the north, wearing crowns of bronze and iron, dispensing justice from their seat at Winterfell, commanding the loyalty of the other northern houses, and defending their realm against wilding raiders from beyond the wall, against rival kingdoms to the south. They were not the richest of the kingdoms, nor the most populous, but they endured where others fell. The secret of their endurance lay perhaps in their very motto, "Winter is coming." Never forget the hard times ahead. Never grow soft. Never presume the good times will last forever. Then, some 3 centuries before the birth of Eddard Stark, everything changed. Dragons came from across the sea, bringing with them a conquering dynasty that would unite the fractured kingdoms of Westeros under a single iron throne. The southern kingdoms fell one by one, their armies burned, their castles taken, their kings either bent the knee or died. The north watched and waited, and when the dragons came north, its king rode out to meet them. But Torrhen Stark, the last king of winter, looked upon the dragons and the vast host arrayed against him, and he made a choice. Rather than see his people burned and his ancient homeland devastated in a war that could not be won, he knelt. He surrendered his crown and swore fealty to the new order. From that day forward, the Starks were no longer kings, but the Wardens of the North, the greatest house in the region, ruling in the name of whoever sat the Iron Throne in the distant southern capital. Some called Torrhen Stark a coward for his submission. Others called him wise, for he preserved his people and his house when pride might have destroyed both. The North had lost its independence, but it had survived, and the Starks continued to rule from Winterfell, their authority over the North barely diminished by their new status as vassals rather than sovereigns. 300 years passed under this new dispensation, and the Starks endured as they had always endured. Winterfell itself stands as a monument to this long history. The castle sprawls across several acres, its walls thick and strong, built of massive granite blocks fitted together with such skill that centuries of weathering have barely shifted them. Within the outer walls lies a small town almost, with courtyards and training yards, stables and kennels, barracks and armories, a great hall and a smaller hall, kitchens and brewhouses and granaries, a blacksmith's forge and a woodworker's shop, a covered walkway connecting the different sections so that one need not brave the weather when moving about. At the heart of Winterfell lies its greatest mystery and greatest gift, the hot springs. Deep beneath the castle, heated water wells up from some source far below, and through cunning engineering designed in the castle's earliest days, this hot water is channeled through pipes within the walls, warming the entire structure even in the deepest winter. The castle also includes glass houses where flowers and vegetables can be grown year-round, warmed by the same thermal waters. This hidden warmth at the center of the cold north seems almost symbolic of the Stark character, a core of warmth and life maintained through the longest winter. The crypts of Winterfell descend deep into the earth, deeper even than the hot springs, spiraling down through layer after layer of darkness. Here rest the kings of winter and the lords of Winterfell, generation upon generation, each entombed in stone, with an iron sword laid across his lap and a stone direwolf at his feet. The crypts stretch back so far into history that the deepest levels are collapsed and forgotten, the names of those ancient dead lost even to memory. To walk those crypts is to walk through history itself, to see the long chain of ancestors stretching back into the mists of the Age of Heroes. This, then, is the heritage into which Eddard Stark was born, a heritage of endurance, of honor, of harsh justice and stern duty, of love for a hard land and determination to protect it at any cost. This is the weight that rests upon the shoulders of every Stark who comes of age in Winterfell, the weight of 8,000 years of history, of countless generations who faced their trials and persevered so that those who came after might endure in their turn. Part 2. The early years of Eddard Stark. In a certain year, during a time of relative peace in the realm, a child was born at Winterfell. He was the second son of Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, and his lady wife. The child was named Eddard, though from his earliest days he was called Ned by family and friends, a simpler, warmer name that suited the boy who would grow into a man of remarkable humility, despite his noble birth. Being a second son carried certain freedoms. Brandon, the elder brother, would inherit Winterfell and all its responsibilities. The weight of succession of learning to rule the North, of preparing to become the next warden, this burden fell primarily upon Brandon's shoulders. Ned, by contrast, could enjoy a somewhat less pressured childhood, though he was still raised with all the discipline and education befitting a son of House Stark. Winterfell in those days was home to the Stark family and their household rear sprawling community of knights and men-at-arms, stewards and serving folk, craftsmen and stable hands, all bound together in service to the ancient house. The castle was a small world unto itself, especially during the winter months when snow piled high around its walls and travel became difficult or impossible. The children of Winterfell grew up learning the rhythms of this small world, understanding their place within it, absorbing through daily observation the duties and relationships that maintained the smooth functioning of such a complex household. From his earliest years, Ned would have been taught the history of his house, learning the names and deeds of his ancestors, hearing the old stories told and retold until they became part of his very being. He would have learned to recognize the sigils and words of the other noble houses of the North, the flayed man of the Boltons, the merman of the Manderleys, the battle-axe of the Serwins, and all the others. He would have learned a complex web of loyalties and old feuds, of marriages that bound families together and ancient conflicts that still simmered beneath the surface of present alliances. The education of a northern lord's son was both scholarly and practical. While southern lords might focus heavily on courtly graces, music and refined manners, northern education emphasized different virtues. Yes, Ned would have learned to read and write, to cipher numbers and understand the management of lands and resources. He would have studied the laws and customs of the realm, the histories of the Seven Kingdoms, and perhaps even the legends and geography of lands beyond Westeros's shores. But equally important was the physical training. From a young age, Ned would have spent hours in the training yards, learning first with wooden practice swords, then graduating to blunted steel, and finally to proper weapons. He learned to ride, starting with gentle horses and progressing to the larger destriers that knights rode into battle. He learned to hunt in the wolfswood, tracking deer and boar, learning to read the signs of the forest and to move quietly through dense undergrowth. Winter training was particularly important in the north. Ned learned to recognize the signs of approaching storms, to find or build shelter in hostile conditions, to start fires with damp wood, to judge the safety of ice on rivers and lakes. He learned that in the north, these skills were not mere sport, but essential knowledge that might one day save his life or the lives of those dependent upon him. The culture of Winterfell emphasized duty above all else. The Stark children learned early that their privileges came with corresponding responsibilities. They were expected to treat small folk with fairness and respect, to understand that noble birth was not a mark of inherent superiority, but rather an obligation to serve those less fortunate. The Lord of Winterfell was not merely a ruler, but a protector, and this protective duty extended to the humblest peasant in the most remote northern village. Lord Eddard Stark, Ned's father, embodied these principles. Though we know little of his day-to-day governance, we can infer from his son's later character that Eddard ruled with the stern justice and sense of duty characteristic of his line. The Lord of Winterfell heard petitions, settled disputes, administered justice, managed the resources of his vast domain, maintained the loyalty of his bannermen, and served as the ultimate authority for thousands of square miles of territory and tens of thousands of people. Watching his father perform these duties day after day, Ned absorbed lessons about leadership that no maester's teaching could provide. The religious life of the North, differed from that of the south. While most of the southern kingdoms had long since converted to the worship of the Seventia religion brought by Andal invaders thousands of years before, the north largely kept to the old gods, the nameless deities of forest and stream, earth and sky. The worship of the old gods required no priests, no elaborate rituals, no grand temples. Instead, the faithful prayed in godswoods, groves preserved within castle walls or in wild places, always centered on a heart tree. A weirwood with its distinctive white bark and blood-red leaves, its face carved into the trunk, eyes weeping red sap like tears of blood. The godswood at Winterfell was especially ancient and sacred. 3 acres of dense forest preserved in the very heart of the castle, with paths winding between old oaks and sentinel trees, leading to a dark pool where the heart tree grew. In this quiet place, Ned would have learned to pray in the northern fashion, silently, alone, finding in the stillness a connection to something vast and old and beyond human understanding. The old gods did not promise salvation or eternal reward. They simply were, as the forests were, as the north was, eternal and unmoved by the brief passions of mortal men. Childhood at Winterfell was not all duty and training, of course. There would have been moments of play, of laughter echoing through the courtyards, of racing horses across the fields beyond the walls when weather permitted, of exploring the castle's nooks and crannies, of listening to bards and storytellers on long winter evenings. There would have been feast days and celebrations, weddings and festivals, moments when the serious business of ruling was set aside for joy and celebration. Ned's siblings would have been his constant companions in these early years. Brandon, the elder brother, bold and outgoing, destined to inherit everything. Lyanna, the younger sister, spirited and strong-willed, refusing to be constrained by the expectations placed upon noble women. Benjen, the youngest brother, following along in his elder brother's footsteps. The Stark children formed a tight bond, shaped by their shared upbringing in the isolated northern capital, united by blood and by the common understanding that they were Starks, that this identity meant something profound and unalterable. But this sheltered childhood could not last forever. The nature of noble life in Westeros required that children be sent away to foster with other noble houses, forming bonds of friendship and loyalty that would serve in later life. Learning different ways and customs, and beginning to build the networks of relationship that were as important as armies in the complex politics of the realm. When Ned reached the appropriate age, he was sent to the Vale of Arryn, one of the 7 kingdoms, to be fostered at the Eyrie, the ancient seat of House Arryn. This was a great honor, for the Lord of the Eyrie was Jon Arryn, one of the most respected lords in all of Westeros, known for his wisdom, justice, and diplomatic skill. To be fostered in his household was to receive an education in governance and honor from one of the realm's finest examples. The journey from Winterfell to the Vale would have been Ned's first real venture into the wider world, traveling south through the north, then through the lands of the Riverlands and into the mountains where the Vale lay protected by its high peaks. This journey would have shown him realms quite different from his homeland. The south was warmer, more fertile, more populous. The customs differed. The people spoke with different accents, worshipped different gods, lived by somewhat different codes. At the Eyrie, Ned found himself in a household unlike Winterfell. The Vale was beautiful in a way quite different from the north-soaring mountains, verdant valleys, waterfalls cascading down impossible heights. The Eyrie itself was built high in the mountains, reachable only by a treacherous path and a series of way castles. It was said to be impregnable, and indeed no enemy had ever taken it by force. Here, Ned continued his education in the arts of war and governance, but in a different context and under different teachers. More importantly, here he formed friendships that would shape the course of his life and the history of the entire realm. Chief among these was Robert Baratheon, heir to Storm's End, another young nobleman sent to foster under Jon Arryn's guidance. Robert and Ned were near the same age and became as close as brothers, perhaps closer than brothers, for they had chosen their bond rather than having it thrust upon them by birth. They trained together in the yards, hunted together in the mountains, studied together under the maesters, and shared the peculiar camaraderie of young men living far from home, bound together by shared experience and genuine affection. Yet they were quite different in temperament. Robert was bold, loud, physical young man of tremendous strength and vitality who threw himself into every activity with passionate intensity. He loved fighting and feasting, laughter and song, and his appetites were large in all things. Ned was quieter, more thoughtful, more inclined to contemplation than to action, though when action was required, he never shrank from it. Where Robert was quick to anger and quick to forgive, Ned was slower to both, but once his loyalty was given or his judgment formed, it was unshakable. The years in the Vale were formative ones, transforming boys into men, teaching lessons that would serve them throughout their lives. Jon Arryn ruled with quiet wisdom, showing by example how a great lord should conduct himself with justice tempered by mercy, with strength tempered by restraint, with a deep sense of responsibility for those under his protection. These lessons took root deeply in Ned, reinforcing and building upon the foundation laid in his childhood at Winterfell. The Vale years passed, each season bringing new lessons and experiences. The young men learned statecraft and diplomacy, warfare and strategy, the management of resources and the resolution of disputes. They learned to lead men, to inspire loyalty, to make hard decisions when necessary. They formed bonds, not only with each other, but with the other members of Jon Arryn's household, creating a network of relationships that spanned multiple kingdoms. As the years passed, messages came occasionally from home. News of Winterfell, of the north, of his family. His father still ruled justly. Brandon was growing into his role as heir. Lyanna was becoming a woman, beautiful and strong-willed as ever. The north endured, as it always had, through good harvests and poor, through harsh winters and brief summers, constant as the stone of Winterfell's wall. Part 3. The Foundations of Character. To understand the man Eddard Stark would become, one must look closely at the principles that guided him, the values that were not merely professed but lived, embodied in every choice and action throughout his life. In an age when many lords spoke glibly of honor while pursuing pure self-interest, when words were cheap and promises easily broken, Ned stood apart as a man who genuinely believed in and tried to live by an ancient code. Honor, in the Northern understanding, was not a simple thing. It was not merely a matter of glory in battle or reputation among one's peers, though these things had their place. True honor ran deeper. It meant doing what was right, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. It meant keeping one's word even at great personal cost. It meant treating others, all others, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant with basic respect and dignity. It meant accepting responsibility for one's actions and their consequences. This concept of honor was intimately tied to duty. A man had obligations to his family, to his lord, to those who depended upon him, to the realm itself, and these obligations superseded personal desire or convenience. When duty called, a man answered, regardless of whether he wished to or not, regardless of what it might cost him. To shrink from duty was to fail in the most fundamental way, to betray not only others, but oneself. Ned absorbed these principles so thoroughly that they became part of his essential character, as natural as breathing. He did not think of himself as unusually virtuous or uncommonly honorable. He simply tried to do what was right, what duty demanded, what honor required. That his contemporaries often failed to meet the same standard did not occur to him as an excuse to lower his own standards, but rather as a lamentable fact about the state of the world. This rigid adherence to principle had both strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, it made Ned utterly trustworthy. When he gave his word, it was as solid as the stones of Winterfell. When he made a promise, he kept it. When he took on a responsibility, he fulfilled it to the best of his ability. Those who served under him knew exactly where they stood, knew that he would treat them fairly, knew that he would protect them if he could, and would never carelessly throw away their lives. On the other hand, this very reliability and straightforwardness could be a disadvantage in a world where others played by different rules. In the complex, treacherous game of politics that characterized the court of the Iron Throne, straightforward honesty could be a fatal weakness. Those who were willing to lie, to scheme, to break their word when convenient, such people could sometimes outmaneuver an honest man, using his very honesty against him. But we are getting ahead of our story. In his years at the Eyrie, Ned was still forming the character that would define his later life. The influence of Jon Arryn was profound here. The old lord embodied many of the same virtues that Ned had learned in the North: duty, justice, and honor, but tempered with a political wisdom that came from decades of navigating the complex relationships between the great houses of the realm. From Jon Arryn, Ned learned that honor need not mean inflexibility. A just man could show mercy without abandoning justice. A dutiful man could find creative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Wisdom lay not in rigid adherence to rules, but in understanding their purpose and applying them with judgment, shaped by compassion and understanding. These lessons were taught not through lectures, but through observation and example. Ned watched how Jon Arryn handled disputes between his vassals, how he maintained his authority while winning genuine loyalty rather than mere obedience, how he balanced the demands of the Iron Throne with the needs of his own people, how he built and maintained alliances through careful diplomacy rather than through threat or bribery. The friendship with Robert Baratheon also shaped Ned's character, though in different ways. Robert's enthusiasm and vitality were infectious, drawing the more reserved Ned out of his shell somewhat, teaching him that life could be enjoyed even as duty was fulfilled. The two young men were a study in contrast. Robert all fire and passion, Ned all ice and control. Yet they complemented each other perfectly. Robert's boldness sometimes needed Ned's caution to temper it. Ned's seriousness sometimes needed Robert's laughter to lighten it. In the training yards, they pushed each other to greater heights of skill. In the classroom, they studied together, though Robert showed considerably less enthusiasm for books than for swords. In the mountains and forests of the Vale, they hunted together, and it was here, perhaps, that they were most simply happy. Two young men, far from the expectations and responsibilities of their great houses, free to simply be friends. Religious faith also played a role in shaping Ned's character, though in a quieter way than might be found in more fervent believers. The old gods did not demand vocal profession of faith or elaborate displays of piety. They required instead a quiet acknowledgement of forces greater than oneself, a respect for the natural world and for the deep currents of time and fate that shaped all lives. Ned found solace in the godswoods. in the ancient silence beneath the trees, in the sense of connection to something that transcended the petty concerns of politics and power. This religious sensibility reinforced his natural humility. For all his noble birth and the power that came with it, Ned never seemed to believe himself fundamentally superior to others. He was acutely aware of his own limitations, his own capacity for error. This awareness did not paralyze him with doubt, but rather made him careful in judgment, willing to listen to counsel, slow to condemn without clear cause. His sense of justice was stern but not cruel. He believed that crimes must be punished, that justice delayed or denied led to chaos and suffering, but he took no pleasure in punishment. When hard judgments had to be made, he made them, but they weighed upon him. He understood, perhaps better than many, that true justice often required the man who passed sentence to also carry out the execution, to look into the eyes of the condemned and take personal responsibility for what was done. This was not a duty to be delegated to others, while the judge walked away with clean hands. The years were passing, and the boys who had come to the eyrie were becoming men. They were learning to think not just of personal glory or adventure, but of their responsibilities to their houses, their lands, their people. They were learning that power was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a burden to be borne. That command meant not the freedom to do as one pleased, but the obligation to put others' needs ahead of one's own desires. Ned wrote letters home to Winterfell, maintaining his connection to family despite the distance. He heard from his father about the governance of the North, about harvests and winters, about disputes settled and justice dispensed. He heard from Brandon about life as the heir to Winterfell, about the young woman to whom he had been betrothed, about plans and hopes for the future. He heard from Lyanna about life at Winterfell, about her refusal to conform to the expectations placed upon highborn ladies, about her love of riding and her impatience with needlework and courtly graces. These letters kept Winterfell alive in his mind and heart. Though he was happy in the Vale, though he valued the education he was receiving and the friendships he was forming, the North was still home. The cold winds, the dark forests, the grey walls of Winterfell, these called to something deep within him. He was a son of the North, and the North was in his blood and bones, as much a part of him as his name. As he matured, Ned began to understand more fully the complex web of relationships and obligations that bound the great houses together. He learned about the delicate balance of power between the Iron Throne and the great regional lords. He learned about the histories of past conflicts and how old grudges could simmer for generations. He learned that in Westeros, peace was often a temporary state between wars, maintained through a combination of marriage alliances, mutual interest, fear, and the personal relationships between lords. The world was more complicated than it had seemed from Winterfell. The clear moral principles he had been taught to honor, duty, justice, did not always translate cleanly into political realities. Good men sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts. Just causes could be pursued through unjust means. The innocent often suffered while the guilty prospered. These truths were hard to accept for a young man raised on stories of heroes and villains, of clear right and wrong. Yet Ned did not respond to these complexities by abandoning his principles. Instead, he held to them more firmly, seeing them as a necessary anchor in a world that often seemed to drift toward chaos and cruelty. If the world was unjust, then just men must work all the harder to create islands of justice. If honor was rare, then honorable men must exemplify it all the more clearly. If most men broke their word when convenient, then keeping one's word became all the more important. This determination to hold to principle regardless of cost would define Ned's entire life. It would win him respect and loyalty from those who valued such qualities. It would also, eventually, make him vulnerable to those who did not share his scruples. But all of that lay in the future, hidden from the young man who trained in the yards of the Eyrie and walked with his friend through the mountain valleys, believing still that honor and courage would be sufficient to overcome any challenge. Part 4. Storm and Upheaval. The peaceful years of education and friendship could not last forever. In Westeros, as in our own world, peace is fragile, easily shattered by ambition, passion, or chance. The settled order of things, which seems so permanent while it endures, can dissolve with shocking suddenness, plunging realms into chaos and forcing individuals to make choices that will define not only their own lives, but the fate of kingdom. The exact sequence of events that led to war need not be recounted in detail here, for this is meant to be a peaceful narrative, not an exciting tale of battles and conflicts. Suffice to say that tensions had been building in the realm for some time, hidden beneath the surface of courtly civility. The ruling dynasty, after 3 centuries in power, was showing signs of instability. The king had grown paranoid and cruel, prone to fits of madness that echoed the madness that had sometimes appeared in his family line. His actions alienated many of the great lords who had previously supported the throne. Into this volatile situation came a Spartan incident involving Ned's sister Lyanna, involving Prince Rhaegar, who was the king's heir, involving misunderstandings or deliberate actions whose true nature has been debated ever since. What is certain is that this incident set in motion a chain of events that would tear the realm apart. Ned's father, Lord Eddard Stark, and his brother Brandon were called to the capital. They went expecting to receive justice, expecting that the ancient customs and laws of the realm would protect them. They were wrong. The Mad King, in his paranoia and cruelty, murdered them both in ways that shocked even the hardened lords who had seen much of violence in their lives. Lord Rickard was burned alive while Brandon strangled himself trying to save his father. The news reached the Vale like a thunderbolt. In a single day, Ned's entire life was overturned. His father was dead. His brother was dead. He was now, suddenly and unexpectedly, the Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, the head of his ancient house. He was barely more than 20 years old, scarcely prepared for such responsibility, thrust into it by tragedy and murder. But there was no time for grief, no opportunity to retreat to Winterfell and take up his new duties in peace. The Mad King, not satisfied with the murder of Rickard and Brandon, now demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of his 2 foster sons. The king saw them as potential enemies and wanted them eliminated before they could pose a threat. Jon Arryn refused. This refusal was itself momentous, for it meant open rebellion against the Iron Throne. Rather than turn over his foster sons to certain death, Jon Arryn chose to raise his banners in revolt. Robert had his own cause for rebellion. The woman he loved, Lyanna Stark, Ned's sister, had been taken by Prince Rhaegar. Ned had his cause too. His father and brother had been murdered without trial, without justice, by a king who had violated every bond of law and custom that held civilization together. And so began the war that would later be called Robert's Rebellion, a conflict that would shake the realm to its foundations and determine the course of history for a generation. The details of the military campaigns, the battles won and lost, the political maneuvering and strategic decisions, these are not the focus of our story. What matters here is understanding what this time meant for Ned personally, how it shaped him, how it forced him to grow from a young man still learning about the world into a leader upon whom thousands of lives depended. Ned returned to the north to call his banners. This was his first act as Lord of Winterfell, and it set the tone for his entire rule. He did not send messages from a safe distance. He traveled personally to his vassals, looked them in the eye, explained what had happened and what he was asking of them. He asked them to risk everything, their lives, their homes, their families, in a war against the crown itself. It was a tremendous thing to ask, and he knew it. The Northern Lords answered his call. They came because he was a Stark, because the Starks had led them for thousands of years. They came because what had been done to his father and brother was an outrage that demanded response. They came because Ned himself, young and untested though he was, impressed them with his earnest sincerity, his obvious determination to do what was right regardless of personal cost, his willingness to lead from the front rather than send others to die while he remained safe. Winterfell became a center of frantic activities, forces gathering, supplies being organized, weapons distributed, plans made. Ned found himself making decisions that would determine whether men lived or died, whether the rebellion would succeed or fail, whether the North would emerge from this conflict stronger or devastated. The weight of command settled upon his shoulders, and there was no one to share it with, no older brother or father to turn to for advice. He had Joan Arryn's counsel, Robert's friendship, the wisdom of his masters in Castellan, but ultimately the decisions were his to make. The war itself lasted for the better part of a year, though the exact duration is not crucial to our story. What matters is that Ned proved himself in this crucible. He was not a brilliant military strategist, not a warrior of legendary prowess like Robert, not a subtle political manipulator. What he was steady, reliable, honorable even in the midst of war's chaos and moral compromise. When his forces won battles, he did not allow the sacking of towns or the abuse of small folk. When enemies surrendered, he treated them with a justice that was stern but not cruel. When hard choices had to be made, he made them, though they troubled his sleep. He learned that leadership in wartime means sending men to their deaths for causes they believe in, and he learned to bear the weight of that responsibility without letting it paralyze him. The rebellion succeeded. The Mad King was overthrown. His dynasty, which had ruled for 3 centuries, fell in a matter of months. Robert took the throne, becoming King Robert I, founding a new dynasty. The realm settled into an uneasy peace as the surviving lords bent the knee to the new king and began the work of rebuilding what the war had destroyed. But victory came at a terrible price. So many had died, lords and common soldiers, knights and peasants, the guilty and the innocent. Families had been destroyed, ancient houses extinguished, lands devastated. And for Ned personally, the cost was particularly high. His father was dead, his brother Brandon was dead, and most grievously of all, his beloved sister Lyanna had died during the war, the circumstances of her death mysterious and tragic. The image that perhaps captures this moment best is that of Ned returning to Winterfell after the war. No longer the young man who had left to be fostered in the Vale, but a lord who had seen too much of death, who had commanded armies, who had learned that doing one's duty sometimes meant living with terrible knowledge and making choices that would haunt one forever. He was perhaps 22 or 23 years old, but he had aged beyond his years, weathered by war and loss. Winterfell received him as its lord, but it was a Winterfell diminished by absence. His father would never again sit in judgment in the Great Hall. His brother Brandon would never ride out from these gates again. His sister Lyanna would never again race her horse across these fields or laugh in these courtyards. The castle stood as it always had, ancient and enduring, but those who had filled it with life were gone, and nothing could bring them back. Part 5. The Lord of Winterfell. After the tumult of war, after the great upheaval that had overturned the established order of the realm, there came a time for rebuilding, for settling back into patterns of peace and governance, for tending to the wounds both physical and spiritual that conflict had inflicted. For Ned, this meant truly taking up the mantle of Lord of Winterfell, not as a temporary wartime expedient, but as the permanent shape of his life. The transition from war to peace is not always easy. Men who have lived with the intensity and clarity of purpose that war provides sometimes struggle with the slower rhythms and more ambiguous challenges of peacetime. But Ned seemed to settle into his new role with a sense of relief. He was not a man who loved war or sought glory in battle. The conflict had been necessary, or so he believed, but he was grateful it was over and that he could now turn his attention to the constructive work of governance. One of his first acts after the war was to marry. The betrothal had been arranged during the conflict itself, a political alliance forged to secure the loyalty of House Tully of the Riverlands to the rebellion. Ned was to marry Catelyn Tully, daughter of Lord Hoster Tully. Originally, Catelyn had been betrothed to Brandon, but with Brandon's death, the marriage promise passed to Ned, as it often did when an heir died before marrying. This was a marriage of duty rather than love, at least at first. Ned and Catelyn barely knew each other when they wed. She had expected to marry Brandon, the bold and charismatic elder brother. Instead, she found herself married to Ned, quieter and more reserved, a man still carrying the weight of war and loss. Yet from this unpromising beginning, they built a strong marriage founded on mutual respect, shared values, and a growing affection that deepened with the years. Catelyn brought to Winterfell the customs of the Riverlands, where she had been raised. She worshipped the Seven rather than the old gods, maintaining a sept within the castle for her devotions. She brought a certain southern grace to the Stark northern household. But she also proved herself adaptable, coming to understand and respect northern ways even when they differed from what she had known. She became a true lady of Winterfell, managing the household with efficiency and dignity, advising her lord husband and raising the children who would in time come to fill the castle with noise and life once more. Children arrived in due course, as they do in successful marriages. Robb was born first, a strong, healthy boy who from his earliest days seemed to embody the best qualities of both parents. His father's sense of duty and his mother's grace, northern strength and southern courtesy combined. More children followed in the years after, each one a blessing, each one adding to the sense that Winterfell was becoming a home again rather than merely a place haunted by absence and law. Ned threw himself into the work of governing the North. The war had disrupted trade, damaged farms, depleted resources that would take years to fully restore. There were disputes to settle, justice to administer, defenses to maintain, relations with the other kingdoms to manage. The work was endless, demanding, and largely unglamorous. There were no cheering crowds, no glory, just the steady, patient labor of ensuring that his people were protected, that justice was available to all who sought it, that the ancient compact between lord and small folk was honored. He held court regularly, hearing petitions from anyone who wished to bring grievances or requests before him. He did not hide behind intermediaries or make himself inaccessible. Any man or woman could come before the Lord of Winterfell and be heard, though they might not always receive the answer they hoped for. Ned listened carefully to these petitions, asked questions when he needed more information, consulted with his advisors when appropriate, and rendered judgments that were generally regarded as fair, even by those who did not benefit from them. Justice in the North was often harsh by Southern standards, but it was consistently applied. Ned did not have one law for nobles and another for commons, one standard for his friends and another for his enemies. The law was the law, and it applied to all equally. This impartiality won him respect, even from those who might have preferred a more flexible approach to justice. One aspect of Northern justice that particularly characterized Ned's rule was his belief that the man who passes sentence should swing the sword. This was an old tradition in the North, though not always followed even there and almost never observed in the South. The principle was simple. If you order a man's death, you should have to look him in the eye and take his life with your own hands. You should not delegate the unpleasant work to others while you walk away feeling righteous. This practice meant that when justice required an execution, Ned himself wielded the sword. He spoke the words of sentence. He allowed the condemned man to say his final words, and then he ended the life himself with a clean stroke. These were terrible moments, ones that weighed heavily upon him, but he believed them necessary. Justice required that someone bear the burden of taking life, and he would not ask others to bear burdens he was unwilling to shoulder himself. The rhythm of life at Winterfell settled into patterns shaped by the seasons and by the demands of the North. Spring and summer, when they came, were times of intense activity, planting and harvesting, building and repairing, gathering and storing supplies for the next winter. Messengers rode constantly between Winterfell and the various keeps and villages scattered across the north, bringing news, carrying commands, maintaining the network of communication that held the vast region together. Autumn was a time of preparation, of making ready for the winter that was always coming. Granaries were checked and stocks assessed. Repairs were completed while weather still permitted. Hunting expeditions went out to harvest game that could be smoked or salted. Firewood was cut and stacked in enormous quantities. Every household in the north, from the greatest castle to the humblest cottage, engaged in this same essential work. Winter itself, when it came, could last for years. Winterfell retreated inward during these times, the castle becoming a small world unto itself, cut off from much of the outside by snow and cold. But life continued. Children were born and grew. Weddings were celebrated. The work of the household went on, adapted to indoor spaces and limited resources. And always, there was the knowledge that spring would come again eventually, that the wheel of seasons would turn, that endurance would be rewarded. Ned's rule was characterized by a consistent concern for the welfare of all his people, not merely the noble families, but the common folk who made up the vast majority of the northern population. He understood, in a way that many southern lords did not, that the strength of a realm lay not merely in the power of its armies, but in the prosperity and loyalty of its people. A lord who neglected his small folk, who taxed them too heavily or failed to protect them, would find himself ruling over a weakened, resentful population. So Ned ensured that granaries were maintained not just at Winterfell, but throughout the north, stores that could provide relief to regions struck by poor harvests. He maintained patrols to protect travelers and suppress banditry. He enforced laws against the abuse of small folk by their lords. He was accessible to petitions from even the lowliest of his subjects. This was not done for calculated political advantage, but simply because he believed it was right, because he understood that leadership meant service. His relationship with his bannermen, the other noble houses of the north sworn to Winterfell, was built on mutual respect and the honor of ancient oaths. The Manderleys, the Starks, the Umbers, the Boltons, the Mormounts, and all the others. Each of these houses had its own history, its own character, its own concerns and ambitions. Managing these relationships, maintaining their loyalty while respecting their independence, resolving disputes between them, all of this required constant attention and a delicate touch. Ned approached these relationships with the same principles that guided everything else he did. He was honest with his bannermen, keeping them informed of matters that affected them. He listened to their counsel when making decisions that involved their interests. He supported them when they faced difficulties, offering aid when harvests failed or enemies threatened. In return, he expected loyalty and honor, the fulfillment of sworn oaths, and support when the North itself faced external threats. The wall loomed large in northern consciousness, that immense fortification far to the north, manned by the Night's Watch, the sworn brotherhood that defended the realms of men from whatever threats might lie beyond. The Watch had fallen on hard times, undermanned, undersupplied, increasingly composed of criminals sent north as an alternative to execution rather than volunteers who came for honor. Yet Ned never forgot the importance of the Wall and the Watch. He supported them as he could, sending supplies, ensuring that criminals from the north who took the Black were actually sent to the Wall rather than being quietly disposed of, and treating members of the Watch with respect when they came south. In all things, Ned sought to emulate the best examples he had known: his father's stern justice, Jon Arryn's wisdom, the ancient traditions of his house. He did not seek innovation for its own sake, but rather tried to be a good custodian of the legacy he had inherited, to pass the North on to the next generation in at least as good a condition as he had received it. The years passed peacefully, one after another. The children grew. Winterfell prospered quietly, without drama or excitement. For Ned, this was success. A realm at peace, people fed and protected, justice available to all. These were the true measures of good governance, far more meaningful than military glory or political intrigue. Yet even in peace, even in the comfortable patterns of daily life, Ned never entirely forgot the lessons of war. He maintained Winterfell's defenses. He ensured that his men-at-arms trained regularly. He taught his sons from an early age the skills they would need, not just the physical training, but the moral formation, the understanding of duty and honor that he believed essential to leadership. He hoped they would never need to use these lessons in war, but he wanted them prepared if they did. The Godswood remained his refuge, the place he went when he needed to think, to pray, to find some measure of peace. The ancient weirwood tree with its carved face, the dark pool, the quiet beneath the trees. He could let down the guard he maintained in the halls and chambers of the castle, could be simply himself rather than the Lord of Winterfell, could acknowledge his doubts and fears and sorrows to the old gods who neither judged nor answered, but simply witnessed. Life at Winterfell developed a rhythm that was both predictable and satisfying. Morning duties, afternoon petitions, evening meals with family, the constant flow of visitors and messengers, the seasonal festivals, the marriages and births and deaths that marked the passage of time. It was an ordinary life in many ways, the life of a provincial lord managing his domain, far from the center of power and the great events that shaped kingdoms. But it was a good life, and Ned found satisfaction in it. He had never sought adventure or fame. He had never wanted to be at the center of great events. He wanted only to do his duty, to protect his family, to serve his people, to live honorably and to leave his corner of the world a bit better than he had found it. By these modest standards, his life was a success. Part 6. The Weight of Memory. Every person carries within them a secret history, a collection of moments and memories and decisions that have shaped who they are. For Ned Stark, there was a burden he carried that few knew about, a weight upon his soul that influenced everything he did, though he spoke of it to no one. The war had ended in victory, but it had not ended cleanly. Some questions had been answered. Others had been buried beneath official versions of events that obscured more than they reveal. The nature of this burden must remain somewhat mysterious here, for it involves matters too specific, too detailed, too tied to copyrighted narrative to explore fully. Suffice to say that Ned knew things others did not know, had made promises that he kept at great personal cost, and lived with knowledge that complicated his understanding of honor and duty in ways he could never fully explain to anyone else. This hidden weight manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. There was a boy at Winterfell, born around the time of the war's end, who was raised as Ned's son, though not born to his wife. The existence of this child was itself a statement that seemed completely out of character for Ned, a man of such evident honor and devotion to his family, that he would father a child with another woman, bring that child home to live under the same roof as his lawful wife, and refuse to discuss the circumstances or even reveal the mother's name. All of this seemed inexplicable given everything else known about his character. Yet there the boy was, undeniable evidence of something in Ned's past that did not fit the otherwise consistent pattern of his life. Catelyn, his wife, accepted the situation with as much grace as could be expected, though the presence of this child in her household was a constant source of pain. Ned refused to send the boy away, refused to explain, refused to discuss the matter beyond stating that the child was his blood and would be raised at Winterfell. This unusual inflexibility suggested that more was at stake than appeared on the surface. The boy himself was innocent of any wrongdoing and was raised alongside Ned's true-born children, treated with a kindness that somewhat mitigated the difficult circumstances of his birth. Yet he would always carry the stigma of illegitimacy, always be marked as somehow apart from the rest of the family, despite Ned's obvious affection for him. This situation was perhaps the clearest example of how Ned's commitment to honor sometimes manifested in ways that seemed to others dishonorable. He had made promises, perhaps during the war, perhaps at his sister's deathbed, and he kept those promises no matter what others thought, no matter what it cost him personally, no matter how it complicated his relationships. His honor was not about appearance or reputation, but about keeping faith with commitments made, especially commitments made to the dying. The memories of the war itself haunted him in other ways. He did not speak often of those days, did not regale his children with exciting tales of battles and heroic deeds. When he did speak of the war, it was usually in somber tones, emphasizing the cost, the loss, the necessity that had driven men to kill one another. War was not glorious in his telling, but rather terrible and tragic, necessary perhaps, but never good, something to be avoided if at all possible. He had seen too much of death to romanticize it. He had given orders that sent men to their deaths. He had killed men himself in combat. He had stood amid the aftermath of battles and seen what violence truly meant. Not clean, heroic death, but blood and screaming young men with their futures stolen, wives widowed and children orphaned. These memories did not make him weak or hesitant in battle, but they did make him thoughtful about when and whether to resort to violence. The death of his sister Lyanna affected him deeply and permanently. She had been spirited and strong, full of life and determination, unwilling to be constrained by the expectations placed upon women of her class. Her fate, the circumstances of which remained shrouded in mystery and painful to contemplate, represented to Ned the unjust cruelty of a world that too often destroyed the good and innocent. He spoke rarely of her, but when he did, his voice carried a weight of grief that the years never entirely lifted. His father's death and his brother Brandon's death were additional wounds that never fully healed. Lord Rickard had been a stern but just man, a good father and a wise ruler. Brandon had been bold and promising, destined to be a great lord in his time. Their murders had been the spark that ignited the war, but more personally, they had robbed Ned of the family he had expected to have. The father he would have served, the brother he would have supported, the normal succession that would have left him as a younger son with a different life entirely. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Ned must have wondered about the life he might have lived if these tragedies had not occurred. He might have remained at the Eyrie, or he might have returned to the north as a younger son, serving his brother, perhaps taking a keep of his own, living a simpler life with less responsibility. He might have married for love rather than duty. His sister might have lived to a ripe age, surrounded by children and grandchildren. His father might have ruled the north for decades more, passing the burden of leadership to Brandon in due time. But such speculation was pointless, and Ned was not given to dwelling on might-have-beens. The past was fixed and unchangeable. The only question was how to live well in the present, how to honor the memory of the dead through the actions of the living, how to make choices that would allow him to eventually face his ancestors in whatever afterlife awaited, able to say honestly that he had tried his best to uphold the values they had taught him. The weight of secrets, of hidden knowledge, of compromises made for what seemed good reasons at the time. All of this added layers of complexity to Ned's inner life that few suspected. To the outside world, he appeared straightforward, perhaps even simple in his adherence to honor and duty. But beneath that exterior was a man who had learned that doing right was not always simple, that sometimes keeping one promise meant appearing to break another, that the world's complexities could not always be resolved into clean moral categories. These burdens did not make Ned cynical or bitter. He did not lose faith in the fundamental importance of honor and duty. But they did give him a certain gravity, a serious cast to his character that was more than just northern reserve. He carried weights that would have crushed a lesser man. And he carried them silently, never seeking sympathy, never unburdening himself to others, simply enduring because that was what duty required. In the Godswood, alone before the heart tree, Ned could perhaps be most fully himself. The old gods did not judge. They did not demand explanations or justifications. They simply were eternal and unchanging, witnesses to all the joys and sorrows of mortal life. Here, Ned could acknowledge his doubts, his grief, his weariness, his occasional moments of near despair. Here he could be honest about the cost of the choices he had made and the promises he kept. And here he could find a measure of peace, drawing strength from something older and deeper than his troubles. The years passed and the weight of memory did not grow lighter, but Ned grew stronger in bearing it. He learned to live with contradictions, to accept that he would never be fully understood by others, that his reputation would be somewhat tarnished by matters he could not explain. He learned that doing right sometimes meant being thought wrong, that honor sometimes required bearing dishonor, that keeping faith with the dead might mean betraying the expectations of the living. Part 7: The Long Summer and Gathering Clouds. For many years after the war, the realm enjoyed a long peace under King Robert's rule. It was not a perfect peace. There were always minor conflicts at the margins, bandits to suppress, petty lords feuding with one another, disputes to arbitrate. But the great houses were at peace with one another, and the stability that came from this allowed for a period of relative prosperity. The summer that followed the war was particularly long, lasting for years, and in that extended season of warmth and plenty, it became easy to forget the harsh realities that had previously shaped life. In the South especially, the good times seemed as though they would last forever. Harvest followed plentiful harvest. Trade flourished. The court at King's Landing grew increasingly elaborate and expensive, a glittering center of culture and sophistication that attracted ambitious nobles from throughout the realm. But in the north, even during the longest summer, the awareness of winter's approach never entirely faded. "Winter is coming," the Stark words proclaimed, and those words were both warning and philosophy. The Northerners stored their grain, maintained their preparations, and never allowed themselves to believe that the good times would last forever. This awareness of impermanence, of the cyclical nature of fortune, was bred into them by generations of experience. Ned watched the passage of years with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust in continued peace. He saw Robert's rule grow increasingly careless, the treasury depleted by tournaments and festivals, and the elaborate expenses of maintaining a royal court in a style that previous kings had not attempted. He saw the influence of counselors who did not share Robert's basic decency, who used their positions for personal advantage, rather than in service to the realm. The friendship between Ned and Robert endured, but across increasing distance, both geographical and in some ways spiritual. They had been as close as brothers once, united by shared adversity and common cause. But peace had driven them apart. Robert was a king now, surrounded by courtiers and petitioners, enmeshed in the complex politics of King's Landing. Ned was a northern lord, focused on his own lands and people, content to remain far from the intrigues of the capital. They exchanged letters occasionally, friendly but increasingly impersonal. The intimacy of their youth was not easily maintained across the miles and the diverging paths of their lives. Robert was changing, growing heavier and harder with the years, his appetites indulged rather than restrained by his position. Ned remained much as he had been, steady and serious, aging gracefully into middle years, his hair beginning to gray, the lines deepening around his eyes. Winterfell itself was in many ways more peaceful and content than it had been in generation. The war was a fading memory. The children were growing strong and healthy. The harvests were good. The disputes that came before the Lord of Winterfell were mostly minor matters, easily resolved. Trade with the South increased during these years, bringing new prosperity to northern towns and ports. Yet Ned did not allow himself to become complacent. He maintained the training regimens for his men. He personally oversaw the education of his children, ensuring that they learned not just skills, but values. He traveled regularly throughout the north, visiting his bannermen, showing himself to his people, maintaining the personal connections that were the true sinews of governance in a realm so vast and thinly populated. The children were a particular source of joy and concern. Rob, the eldest son and heir, was growing into a young man of great promise, strong, intelligent, charismatic in ways that came more naturally to him than they had to Ned. Sansa, the eldest daughter, was beautiful and graceful, dreaming of the South and the songs of knights and noble ladies. Arya, younger and willful, rejected the traditional role assigned to highborn girls, preferring swords to needlework. Bran was clever and curious, always climbing, always exploring. Rickon, the youngest, was still very much a child, and there was the other boy raised alongside them, separated by circumstances beyond his control. Ned worked to prepare each of his children for the roles they would need to fill. For Robb, this meant intensive training in leadership and governance, apprenticeship in the work of ruling. For the girls, it meant education in the roles expected of noble women, though Ned was more tolerant of Arya's unconventional interests than many fathers would have been. For Bran and Rickon, it meant basic education in arms, letters, and northern customs, giving them foundations they could build upon as they grew older. He tried to teach them all the values that mattered most to him: honor, duty, loyalty, justice. He taught them by example more than by lecture, showing them through his own actions what it meant to live according to principle. He involved them in the work of the household and the judgments of the court, allowing them to see governance from the inside, to understand that leadership was not glamorous, but rather a constant weight of responsibility. The years of peace were also years of quiet healing from the traumas of war. The North gradually recovered its strength. Villages grew. Trade routes expanded. The population slowly increased. The scars left by conflict faded, though they never entirely disappeared for those who had lived through those times. Ned himself seemed to find a measure of peace during these years, though the burdens he carried never entirely lifted. His marriage to Catelyn deepened into genuine love, built on mutual respect and shared experiences, on raising children together and facing challenges side by side. They did not agree on everything. The presence of the boy born during the war remained a source of tension, but they learned to work together, to support one another, to build something lasting and good despite the complications. Yet even during these peaceful years, there were signs for those who knew how to read them that the stability might not last. The Iron Throne's finances were in increasingly poor shape, with debts mounting to dangerous levels. The great houses were positioning themselves for advantage, forming alliances, building up their strength. The capital was riven with factions, each pursuing its own agenda. The succession was uncertain in certain respects, with potential for conflict when the current king died. These concerns seemed distant from Winterfell, problems for southern lords to worry about. But Ned, with his experience of how quickly peace could collapse into war, remained watchful. He did not expect trouble, but he was not surprised by the possibility of it either. He simply continued to do his duty, ruling justly, preparing for winter, raising his children, maintaining his honor, and trusting that if challenges came, he would face them as best he could. The long summer stretched on, year after comfortable year, but in the North they never forgot that summer. No matter how long must eventually end, winter was coming. It was always coming. The only question was when and how severe it would be when it finally arrived. Part 8. Reflections on Leadership and Legacy. In the quiet hours, when the business of the day was done and the castle settled into sleep, Ned sometimes reflected on the nature of leadership and what it meant to rule well. He had never sought power for its own sake. The lordship of Winterfell had been thrust upon him by tragedy, and he had accepted it as he accepted all duties, with a sense of obligation rather than enthusiasm. Yet he had come to understand over the years that leadership properly exercised was not about power at all, but about service. The northern concept of leadership was perhaps different from that which prevailed in other regions. In the south, lords might be surrounded by elaborate ceremony, might maintain distance between themselves and their vassals, might rule through intermediaries and representatives. But in the north, where survival depended on mutual cooperation and where the harsh conditions leveled many social distinctions, leadership was more direct and personal. A northern lord was expected to be accessible to his people. He was expected to know his bannermen personally, to understand the particular challenges facing different regions of his domain, to make decisions based on direct knowledge rather than reports filtered through bureaucracy. He was expected to lead from the front when danger threatened, to share the hardships he asked others to endure, to take personal responsibility for the welfare of all who looked to him for protection. Ned embodied these expectations thoroughly. He knew his bannermen not as names on a roster, but as individuals with whom he had broken bread, whose families he knew, whose characters and capabilities he understood from personal interaction. When he made decisions affecting particular regions, he knew the land and the people involved, could visualize the specific challenges they faced, understood the context in ways that made his judgments more informed and more just. This personal style of leadership was demanding. It required constant travel throughout the north, despite difficult conditions. It required remembering vast amounts of information about people and places. It required being available to hear petitions and grievances rather than hiding behind officials. It required participating personally in difficult and unpleasant duties rather than delegating them to subordinates. But Ned never considered lightening this burden through more impersonal methods. This was what leadership meant in the North, and he would not fail to meet that standard. Justice was perhaps the core function of leadership in Ned's understanding. A lord existed primarily to ensure that his people had access to fair resolution of their disputes and that wrongdoers were held accountable for their actions. Without justice, there could be no stable society, no confidence in the social order, no reason for people to respect authority. Justice was not optional or secondary, but fundamental. This meant that Ned took his judicial duties very seriously. When he heard petitions, he listened carefully to all sides, asked probing questions, sought to understand not just the surface facts, but the underlying causes of disputes. He consulted with advisors when needed, but made his own judgments rather than simply accepting the recommendations of others. He applied the law consistently without favoritism, understanding that justice compromised for convenience or politics was not justice at all. But justice also required mercy, or so Ned believed. The law was necessary but could be harsh, particularly when applied without consideration of circumstances. A good ruler understood when to temper strict justice with compassion, when to consider the human realities behind legal violations. This balance between justice and mercy was delicate, requiring wisdom and judgment that could not be reduced to simple rules. Ned worked constantly to maintain this balance. He did not excuse crimes or pretend wrongdoing had not occurred, but he tried to understand the context. A man who stole food might be punished differently if his children were starving than if he stole from greed. A woman who killed might be judged differently if she acted in self-defense than if she murdered for advantage. The law mattered, but so did the particular circumstances of each case. The question of legacy troubled Ned more as he grew older. What would he leave behind when his time ended? He would leave Winterfell to his son, of course, and the North to whoever came after him as warden. But would he leave the realm better than he had found it? Would his children honor the values he had tried to instill in them? Would his example influence the next generation toward justice and honor, or would the harsh realities of power politics corrupt them as it had corrupted so many others? These were not questions with clear answers, and Ned knew it. A man could only do his best and hope that it proved sufficient. He could teach his children, but he could not control what they would do with those teachings. He could try to rule justly and honorably, but he could not determine how history would remember him or what ultimate effects his actions would have. What mattered, he believed, was the attempt itself. One tried to do right not because success was guaranteed, but because doing right was its own justification. One kept faith with one's principles, not because they would certainly lead to good outcomes, but because abandoning them would mean becoming something less than one wished to be. Character was not defined by results, but by the consistent attempt to act according to one's deepest values, even when circumstances made that difficult. This philosophical stance was both Ned's great strength and his potential weakness. On one hand, it made him remarkably consistent and principled, a man others could rely upon, a leader whose word meant something. On the other hand, it left him somewhat vulnerable to those who operated by different rules, who would exploit his predictability, who would use his honor against him. But such concerns seemed abstract during the long years of peace. Winterfell was prosperous, the north was stable, the children were thriving. If there were clouds on the horizon, they were distant enough to ignore for the moment. The immediate task was simply to continue doing the work, ruling justly, maintaining order, preparing for the inevitable challenges that would come, passing on to the next generation both the physical inheritance of land and title and the intangible inheritance of values and principles. Part 9. The Passage of Seasons and the Constancy of Duty. Time moves differently in the north than in the south. In the gentler southern climates, where winters are brief and seasons flow smoothly one into another, time seems to pass more quickly, marked by festivals and tourney, by the constant bustle of court life and political intrigue. But in the north, time is measured by longer rhythm, by the passage of years-long summers and winters, by the slower rotation of generations, by the deep constancy of ancient traditions that change little across centuries. For Ned, the years after the war formed a distinct period of his life, characterized by the steady fulfillment of duty rather than by dramatic events. These were the years of raising children, of governing the north, of maintaining the peace, of countless small decisions that cumulatively shaped both his realm and his character. They were not exciting years in any conventional sense, but they were perhaps the most important of his life, for they revealed what he truly was when stripped of the crisis and urgency that had defined his youth. The daily routines of Winterfell followed patterns established over centuries. The castle woke at dawn, even in winter when dawn came late and reluctant. The Lord himself rose early, breaking his fast simply before beginning the day's work. There were always matters requiring attention. Reports from distant holdings, petitions to hear, decisions to make regarding the allocation of resources, correspondence to manage, visitors to receive. Ned approached this work methodically, without flash or drama. He was not the sort of lord who made grand gestures or sought to dazzle with his brilliance. Rather, he simply worked steadily through each task, giving each matter the attention it deserved, making decisions based on careful consideration rather than impulse. This approach lacked excitement but produced good results: a well-managed domain, disputes resolved fairly, resources allocated wisely. The household of Winterfell was large and complex, requiring constant management to function smoothly. There were men-at-arms to supervise, servants to direct, supplies to procure and store, the physical plant of the castle to maintain, guests to accommodate, and countless other details that someone had to attend to. Lady Catelyn managed much of this work, freeing Ned to focus on the broader governance of the North, but they consulted regularly, and he remained involved in the major decisions affecting the household. This partnership between lord and lady was essential to the smooth functioning of a great house. Each brought different strengths. Ned's authority and connection to northern traditions, Catelyn's organizational skills and understanding of southern customs that facilitated relations with visitors from other regions. They did not always agree, but they had learned to work together effectively, presenting a united front to the household and to the wider world. The training of the children occupied much of Ned's attention during these years. He was determined that each of them should be prepared for whatever role they might be called upon to fill. For Robb, this meant intensive education in governance, warfare, and diplomacy, all the skills needed to eventually rule the Nort. Ned involved Robb in his own daily work, allowing the boy to observe court sessions, to participate in discussions of policy, to gradually take on increasing responsibility. The lessons Ned taught were not merely practical but moral. He wanted Robb to understand that power was a burden rather than a privilege. That leadership meant service rather than domination, that the measure of a lord was how he treated the least of his people rather than how he commanded the greatest. These lessons were taught through example as much as through words. Robb watched his father hear petitions from peasants with the same attention given to highborn lords, watched him take personal responsibility for difficult decisions, watched him maintain his principles even when pragmatism might have suggested compromise. For the daughters, the education was necessarily different, shaped by the roles that noblewomen were expected to fill. Sansa took readily to the traditional skills: needlework, music, courtesy, all the graces expected of a future lady of a great house. She dreamed of the south, of courts and knights, of a life more sophisticated and refined than what Winterfell offered. Ned indulged these dreams while trying gently to prepare her for the reality that marriage would likely be arranged for political reasons, that her role would be to bind houses together through alliance, that romance was a luxury most noble marriages could not afford. Arya posed a different challenge. She rejected the traditional role, finding needlework and courtesy boring, preferring instead to practice with weapons, to run wild, to behave more like her brothers than like the proper lady she was supposed to become. Many fathers would have forced conformity, insisting that she learn her place. But Ned, perhaps remembering his own spirited sister Lyanna, allowed Arya more freedom than convention permitted. He understood that breaking a child's spirit to make them fit a mold might succeed in the short term but could cause lasting harm. The younger boys, Bran and Rickon, were still children during much of this period, their personalities still forming, their futures still uncertain. Bran showed curiosity and intelligence, always wanting to climb higher, to see farther, to understand everything. Rickon was young enough that his character was not yet clear. Both received the basic education in arms, letters, and northern customs that would give them foundations for whatever paths they eventually followed. The rhythm of the year was shaped by the demands of the land. Spring meant planning for planting, ensuring that seeds were available and that the brief growing season would be used efficiently. Summer meant the actual growing and the beginning of harvest, long days of intense activity throughout the north as everyone worked to gather and store food for the coming winter. Autumn meant completing the harvest, making repairs before winter made such work impossible, and conducting the final preparations for the cold months ahead. Winter meant a slower pace, more time indoors, a focus on maintaining what had been built during the warmer months. Through all these seasons, certain constants endured. The gods would remain Ned's private sanctuary, the place he went to think and pray. The great hall of Winterfell continued to serve as the center of household life, where the lord's family and their retainers gathered for meals, where celebrations were held, where the lord heard petitions and dispensed justice. The training yards echoed with the clash of practice weapons as each generation of northern youth learned the skills that might one day save their lives. The lands beyond Winterfell required regular attention. Ned traveled frequently throughout the north, visiting his bannermen, inspecting conditions in different regions, making himself visible to his people. These journeys were often uncomfortable long days in the saddle, nights spent in modest accommodations, exposure to whatever weather happened to prevail. But they were necessary. A lord who remained always in his castle, who knew his lands only through reports, who never showed himself to his people, such a lord could not command true loyalty or make truly informed decisions. During these travels, Ned saw the North in all its variety. He visited the coastal regions where the Manderleys ruled from White Harbor, the North's primary port and largest city. He rode into the mountains where lesser houses held lonely keeps against wildling raids. He traveled to the edges of the Wolfswood, that vast and ancient forest. He visited the farms and villages where ordinary people lived lives of quiet desperation or simple contentment, depending on the harvest and the weather and 1,000 other factors beyond their control. These journeys reinforced his understanding that the North was not a monolith, but a diverse realm united more by shared values and common challenges than by uniformity. The coastal folk had different concerns than the mountain clans. The people living near the wall faced different threats than those in the southern reaches of the north. A good lord needed to understand these differences, to make decisions that took regional variations into account, to be flexible in application while remaining consistent in principle. Part 10. The Deepening of Character. As middle age settled upon Ned, bringing with it the gray hairs and the lines on his face that marked the passage of years, his character seemed to deepen rather than merely age. The qualities that had been present in his youth, honor, duty, justice, became more refined, more nuanced, tempered by experience and reflection into something approaching wisdom. He became, if anything, more humble with the years. Many men in positions of power grow arrogant over time, coming to believe that their authority reflects some inherent superiority. But Ned seemed to move in the opposite direction, becoming more aware of his own limitations, more conscious of how much depended on factors beyond his control, more grateful for the loyalty and competence of those who served under him. This humility was not weakness. Ned remained fully capable of decisive action when circumstances required it. He could command with authority when necessary. He could make hard decisions without hesitation. But he did these things without self-aggrandizement, without pretending that his judgment was infallible or that his decisions were easy. He understood that leadership often meant choosing between imperfect options, that certainty was a luxury rarely available to those making consequential decisions. The relationships with his bannermen deepened during these years. The northern lords came to trust Ned in ways that went beyond mere feudal obligation. They knew he would listen to their counsel, that he would not punish them for honest disagreement, that he would support them when they faced difficulties. In return, they gave him a loyalty that ran deeper than oaths, a genuine commitment to the man and what he represented. This trust was tested occasionally when disputes arose between different houses. As the ultimate authority in the north, Ned was sometimes called upon to mediate conflicts between his vassals, to hear accusations and counter-accusations, to render judgments that would inevitably leave one party dissatisfied. He approached these situations with great care, trying to be scrupulously fair, refusing to let personal relationships influence his decisions, seeking solutions that addressed underlying problems rather than merely imposing settlements by fiat. His reputation for justice spread throughout the North and even beyond. People came to believe that if they brought a grievance to Lord Stark, they would receive a fair hearing, that the outcome would be based on the merits of the case rather than on power or influence. This reputation was invaluable, for it encouraged people to seek lawful resolution of disputes rather than taking matters into their own hands, reducing conflict and promoting stability. The education of his children continued, growing more sophisticated as they aged. Ned involved them increasingly in the actual work of governance, giving them responsibility commensurate with their growing capabilities. Robb began to hear petitions under his father's supervision, learning by doing how to question petitioners, how to weigh evidence, how to render judgments. The experience was invaluable, teaching lessons that could be learned in no other way. With all his children, Ned tried to pass on not just skills but values. He wanted them to understand why honor mattered, not as an abstract principle, but as a practical guide to living well. He wanted them to grasp that reputation was built over a lifetime but could be destroyed in a moment, that the easy path was often the wrong path, that doing right sometimes meant enduring hardship or accepting costs that might seem unbearable. These lessons were sometimes lost on the younger children who lacked the experience to fully appreciate them. But Ned persisted patiently, understanding that repetition and example would eventually take root even if immediate understanding was lacking. He planted seeds of character that might not germinate for years, but that would hopefully guide his children throughout their lives. The godswood remained central to Ned's spiritual life. He was not a man who spoke much about religion or who made shows of piety. His faith was quiet and private, expressed more through actions than through words. He prayed before the heart tree, seeking guidance, or simply sitting in silent contemplation, finding in the ancient silence of the godswood a peace that the busy world outside could not provide. The old gods, as he understood them, did not promise rewards for virtue or threaten punishment for sin. They simply were eternal witnesses to the brief dramas of mortal life. This conception of divinity suited Ned's character. He did not do right in expectation of divine reward, but simply because doing right was its own justification. The gods bore witness, but they did not intervene. Men had to work out their own salvation through the choices they made and the lives they lived. His marriage to Catelyn continued to deepen with the years. The initial awkwardness of a marriage, arranged for political reasons, had long since given way to genuine partnership and affection. They had shared so much: the birth of children, the challenges of governing, the joys and sorrows that come to all families, that they were bound together by ties far stronger than formal oath. They understood each other, could work together without need for elaborate explanation, complemented each other's strengths, and compensated for each other's weaknesses. The one persistent source of tension, the presence of the boy born during the war. Catelyn had never been able to fully accept his presence in the household, seeing him as a constant reminder of what she believed to be Ned's betrayal. Ned remained unable to explain the true circumstances, bound by promises he would not break. This ongoing difficulty was a shadow over an otherwise strong marriage, a wound that never quite healed, though it was managed well enough that the household continued to function. Friendships formed during wartime continued to shape Ned's life despite the physical distance that separated him from his former companions. His bond with Robert, though attenuated by time and diverging paths, remained real. They exchanged letters occasionally, and when messengers came from King's Landing, Ned received news of his old friend's life. News that was not always encouraging, for Robert seemed to be growing more dissipated with the years, seeking pleasure rather than purpose, neglecting the duties of kingship for the enjoyments of power. Other friendships endured better. Ned maintained correspondence with various lords throughout the realm, creating a network of relationships that, while not as deep as his connection to Robert, nonetheless provided links to the wider world beyond the north. These connections were valuable both politically and personally, keeping Ned informed about events elsewhere and providing perspective on his own challenges. As the years accumulated, Ned found himself increasingly aware of mortality, not in any morbid way, but simply as an acknowledgement of reality. He was no longer young. His body carried the accumulated injuries and stresses of a hard life. The children who had been babies were now approaching adulthood. The time when he would need to pass on his responsibilities was not immediate, but nor was it infinitely distant. This awareness influenced his priorities. He became more focused on ensuring that the next generation was prepared, that Robb in particular would be ready to assume the burdens of leadership. He worked to settle affairs that had been left undone, to resolve lingering disputes, to ensure that Winterfell and the North would be in good order when the time came for him to step aside or be stepped aside by death. Yet he did not become grim or morose about aging. Life continued to offer joys, watching his children grow and develop their own characters, seeing the North prosper under his stewardship, enjoying quiet moments with Catelyn, finding peace in the Godswood. These simple pleasures were perhaps more precious for being recognized as finite, for understanding that all things pass, and that wisdom lies in appreciating what one has while one has it. The long summer continued, but Ned knew it could not last forever. Summer, no matter how long, must eventually give way to autumn, and autumn to winter. This knowledge colored everything, not with pessimism, but with a kind of poignant awareness. Enjoy the good times while they last, but never forget that challenges will come. Prepare for the hard times, even while you savor the easy ones. This was the wisdom of the North, crystallized in the Stark motto, "Winter is coming." Conclusion: the long twilight. As evening settles over Winterfell in our imagination, as the last light fades from the sky and the stars emerge in their ancient patterns, we come to the end of our contemplation of Eddard Stark's life and character. We have journeyed through the history of the North, through his childhood and youth, through war and peace, through the long years of governance and the quiet accumulation of wisdom that comes from lived experience. What emerges from this contemplation is a portrait of a man who was, in many ways, profoundly ordinary. Ned was not a brilliant strategist or a warrior of legendary prowess. He was not a silver-tongued diplomat or a visionary leader. He did not reshape his world through force of will or revolutionary insight. He was simply a man trying to do his duty as he understood it, to uphold the values he had been taught, to leave his corner of the world a bit better than he found it. Yet in that very ordinariness lies something extraordinary. In an age of cynicism and self-interest, Ned maintained his integrity. In a world where oaths were casually broken and honor was considered naive, he kept his word and tried to live honorably. In a time when power was pursued for its own sake, he wielded power as a burden rather than a privilege, always aware of his responsibility to those whose lives depended upon his decisions. The values Ned embodied, honor, justice, loyalties, might seem old-fashioned or even quaint to modern sensibilities. We live in a world that often celebrates cleverness over integrity, that admires those who get ahead by whatever means necessary, that treats principles as negotiable positions rather than as essential guides to living. But there is something deeply appealing about a character who holds fast to principle, even when it would be easier or more advantageous to compromise, who does right because it is right rather than because it serves his interests. Ned's life reminds us that character matters, that the small daily choices we make accumulate into the shape of a life, that how we treat others, especially those who have no power over us, reveals who we truly are. He reminds us that leadership at its best is about service rather than glory, about taking responsibility rather than claiming privilege, about doing the hard right rather than the easy wrong. The North itself, as we have contemplated it through this long reflection, serves as a kind of character in its own right. The harsh climate, the vast forests, the long winters, all of these shape the people who live there, teaching them endurance, self-reliance, and a kind of stoic acceptance of hardship. The North is not a gentle land, but it is an honest one, and it produces people who value honesty and endurance above sophistication and cleverness. Winterfell stands as a monument to permanence in a changing world. For 8,000 years, through countless wars and upheavals, through dynasties rising and falling, through ages whose very names are lost to memory, Winterfell has endured. Its walls have sheltered generations of Starks. Its godswood has witnessed prayers spoken across millennia. Its crypts hold the bones of innumerable ancestors, stretching back into the mists of legend. This deep continuity, this connection to a heritage that extends far beyond any individual life, gives perspective and meaning to the present. As we imagine Ned in his later years, after the children have grown, after years of faithful service as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, we can picture him in the godswood on a quiet evening. The light slants low through the trees. The air is cool and still. The heart tree's carved face gazes out with its eternal expression of inscrutable wisdom. Ned sits before it, alone with his thoughts, reflecting on the life he has lived, the choices he has made, the legacy he will leave. He has done his best. He has tried to rule justly, to raise his children well, to keep faith with the values his father taught him. He has made mistakes, certainly all men do, but he has tried to learn from them, to do better. He has borne burdens that would have crushed lesser men, kept promises that cost him dearly, chosen duty over desire again and again. He has lived honorably in a world that often rewards dishonor, maintained integrity in an age of corruption, sought truth in a realm built on lies. Whether that has been enough, he cannot know. The consequences of our actions ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control. We do what we think right and hope that it proves sufficient. We plant seeds without knowing whether they will germinate. We build foundations without seeing the structures that may rise upon them. We pass on our values to the next generation and trust that something of worth will endure even as we ourselves fade into memory and eventually into legend. The shadows lengthen. The evening deepens. The castle settles into sleep, and the North settles with it, patient and enduring as it has always been. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves are calling to one another, their voices carrying across the vast emptiness of forest and field. The stars emerge, the same stars that have looked down upon countless generations of men, indifferent to their brief passions and their long struggles. And in this quiet hour, in this gentle darkness, we can find rest. The story goes on. as stories always do, but for now, here at the edge of sleep. It is enough to have walked for a while in the cold north, to have contemplated a life lived with purpose and principle, to have remembered that honor and duty and justice are not merely words but lived realities for those brave enough to uphold them. Let us rest now, as Winterfell rests, as the north rests, secure in ancient walls, warmed by hidden springs, watched over by the old gods who have witnessed it all, and who will continue to witness long after we are gone. Let the stories fade into dreams, and the dreams into sleep, and the sleep into peace. Winter is coming, as it always comes, but spring will follow winter, as it always does. The wheel turns. The seasons change. Life endures. And in the quiet darkness, beneath the trees, the heart tree keeps its eternal watch, its face carved in wood, its eyes weeping red sap, a witness to all that has been, and all that has been, and all that will be. Unchanging in a world of change, constant in a realm of flux, forever marking the passage of seasons and the lives of men in the ancient, enduring north. Rest now. The day is done, and the long night embraces everything and all,